Yes. Well, again, for those who are joining now, my name is Jose Martinez Carranza, and I will be the chair for this keynote presentation session, the second presentation of the day. And to me, it is a privilege to present Guido De Croon, who is going to be our second keynote speaker. Guido received his Master in Science and Ph.D. in the field of artificial intelligence at Maastricht University. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce it well.
No problem.
From the Netherlands. His research interest lies with computational efficiency and often bio-inspired algorithms for robot autonomy, with an emphasis on computer vision. Since 2008, he has worked on algorithms for achieving autonomous flight with small and lightweight flying robots, such as the DelFly flapping wing micro-air vehicle. In 2011 and 2012, he was a research fellow in the advanced concept team of the European Space Agency, where he studied topics such as optical flow-based control algorithms for extraterrestrial landing scenarios. Currently, he is associate professor, he is full professor at the Technical University of Delft and scientific lead of the Micro-Air Vehicle Laboratory, MAV-lab, of Delft University of Technology. I should also say that Guido has been a strong promoter of the micro-air vehicle research and development. He has himself participated in several competitions in the IMAV and other competitions like the autonomous run racing, the Alpha Pilot. He's very humble and he doesn't mention that, but he has won many awards for his work. So it is really an honor to have him here. And I'm pretty sure that you will find his work quite interesting. So please, Guido, go ahead.
Thank you, Jose, and it's really an honor for me to be invited here at this IMAV. So thank you very much. I don't know how humble the presentation will be, so we'll see about that. Okay, so welcome. Today I will speak to you about insect-inspired AI for swarms of tiny autonomous drones. Oh, okay, let me see about that. Yeah. And so when we think about autonomous drones, we think typically about quadrotors like this one. This is actually a final race that we did in Texas with the AI robotic racing competition, in which drones were racing autonomously and had to finish the track as quickly as possible. So this is not so humble video because yeah, we were indeed the winners of that competition. But this is the kind of drone that you typically think about when you think about autonomous flight. Now, the Micro-Air Vehicle Lab is actually quite well known for also other types of drones that are much lighter and much smaller. So what you see flying into the screen here is DelFly Nimble. So it's a bit in slow motion here. And it's actually performing a very quick evasion maneuver that we also see in fruit flies. And this DelFly Nimble is special because it doesn't only fly by flapping the wings, but it can actuate the wings separately to also steer with the wings. And this makes it so agile that we were able to explain effects of that are actually also present in the fruit fly when making these quick maneuvers. Now, when we talk about autonomous flight of drones, then it's obvious that we need to think of size, weight, and power, because drones are restricted in size, weight, and power. On the left, we have the drone that you saw flying in this autonomous drone race. It has a 70-centimeter diameter and it weighs 3 kilos. And to fly, it consumes around 600 watts. On board, it has an NVIDIA Jetson Xavier, which weighs around 280 grams and consumes around 30 watts, which is a very powerful embedded processor to run, for example, deep nets. So it has many GPUs, it has lots of CPUs, and it has a huge amount of memory. On the right, we have the DelFly Nimble that we just saw. It is actually not super tiny. I mean, it has a 33-centimeter wingspan, It weighs around 29 grams and consumes 6 watts when it's hovering, which is the most energy consuming mode. And it has also a computer on board, but it's a microcontroller. It's an STM32F4. It consumes around 0.2 watts and weighs around 4 grams. This robot has a memory of 192 kilobytes. So that's really, really tiny amount of memory. Of course, yeah, personally, I still knew the Commodore 64, which had 64 kilobytes of memory. So then it's much, but if you compare it to even almost empty Word documents, then 192 kilobytes is a tiny amount of memory. And this has consequences, because if we think of autonomous flight, then we typically think of simultaneous localization and mapping, SLAM. But if you look at typical SLAM algorithms, then they actually consume in the order of hundreds to thousands of megabytes of memory. And we have an example on the right there. And this is, of course, much too much for the memory that we have on board of this tiny flapping. Okay, so SLAM is out of the window. Perhaps we can run deep nets, right? So let's take an example of an embedded processor that can run deep nets, the NVIDIA Jetson TX2. I'll admit these persons because I don't know if it covers my screen. But this NVIDIA Jetson TX2 weighs around 85 grams and consumes around 7.5 watts. And as you see on the left here, yeah, that's much heavier than our total robot. And it's much more than we need to fly in the most energy consuming mode. So also this kind of processor is not an option. Okay, so where does that leave us? Where does that leave us? Are we still able to make these drones autonomous? Well, the solution is actually quite evident, and it's flying around us every day. And so this is a picture of a fruit fly, which I think is an amazing animal because it only has around 100,000 neurons. It's able to fly, avoid obstacles, navigate, find food and shelter, interact socially with other fruit flies, and learn, and all of this for such little processing. I mean, compare this with the number of neurons in our own brain, it's around 86 billion. And so with very little processing, they do a complete range of complex tasks. And this leads to a different way of thinking about autonomy algorithms. And I want to illustrate that with this example. So we see a fruit fly, sorry, if you don't see a fruit fly here, we see a dragonfly on the bottom, and it wants to catch the fly on the right. And it does so in a pretty smart way because the dragonfly actually doesn't fly to where it sees the fly, but it flies to the point where it's going. And that's quite smart. And if I ask engineers to make an algorithm to do this, then they come up with something like this. At first, you need to detect the fly. Then you need to determine its velocity. You need to find out where it's going to in space. And then you should, for example, use a model of yourself to plan ahead and arrive at the same point in time at that same place. And yeah, it is, of course, a pretty difficult, complex task, but this is also quite logical, but quite a complex way of solving it. If we ask biologists, then they come up with this solution. And so biologists have found that dragonflies keep this fly in the same place in their image, and they try to make this image bigger, and then they will end up exactly at the right place. So there can be a very simple solution actually to such a complex problem. And this is the kind of solutions that we find in nature all the time, and especially in these amazing insects. Now you may say to me, Guido, okay, you know, it's nice for this like simple problem, but what about the more difficult problem? Now, one of the more difficult problems that is being tackled in robotics is odor source localization. And you have big complex models where the roboticists model, for example, how odor spreads through an environment and things like that. And that happens in the brain of the robot. But if we look at the fruit fly, then it tackles such difficult problems by linking together actually quite simple behaviors. In this case, what happens is that if there's a draft from the side, then first fruit fly will be casting, and it means it flies orthogonally to the breeze, to the draft. If it senses the odor, then it goes upwind. If it loses the odor, it will start casting again. And we see that here because this is a trajectory of such a fruit fly where it senses, for example, the strawberry here, goes upwind, loses perhaps the odor, starts casting, finds it again, goes upwind. And then by alternating these behaviors, it basically finds this fruit fly. Now, this is the kind of concept that we have been applying, making tiny drones with very small processors fly completely by themselves. And one of the first things we tackled is obstacle avoidance. And what we did is a 20-gram DelFly Explorer. It's a paper that we presented in 2014. And it's a 20-gram vehicle that can take off, fly around, avoid obstacles. And with this, yeah, we believe it's actually still the lightest autonomous drone still today, 7 years later. Now, one of the main achievements here is a stereo vision system that was made by one of my colleagues, Christophe de Wachter. And it has 2 cameras on this little PCB and a small microcontroller, which by now you will recognize. It's this STM again, with this ridiculous low amount of memory. And we're using this processor to actually perform a real-time stereo vision at 30 Hertz on board of the vehicle. Now, the difficulty with the DelFly at the time was that the design was such that it could not hover. If you have a quadrotor or if you have this new DelFly that I showed at the start, then when they see an obstacle, they can just start hovering, turn around, and then go into another direction. But the old DelFly always needed to keep a small forward velocity. And that's why we needed to basically plan ahead a bit. And what we did is the following. So we have the DelFly here. We have the stereo vision on board, and it looks a little bit to the side, yeah, a little bit obliquely. And what it tries to do is it tries to keep this green area here, this droplet shape area, free of obstacles. And when something enters this area, for example, there is a wall that enters this area here, then it triggers a reaction of the DelFly. And the reaction is to first keep flying, and then start circling in the area that it knows to be completely empty, in order to look for a new direction in which to continue to fly. Now, the reasoning behind this is that this angle here is determined by the field of view of the camera, which is not so large. And if you immediately turn, for example, then you may turn into an object that you're not seeing at the moment. And so the reasoning is we want to turn in the free space that we're sure of. And how does that look as a program? Well, we can represent this behavior, this avoidance behavior, as a finite state machine, where each state is a simple behavior and they're linked together in a smart way to basically avoid obstacles. Now, this is a video of the DelFly. We tested it in our natural habitat, which for us is the lecture room. It takes off by itself. It uses a pressure meter to keep the height. That worked actually very well indoors. And yeah, it's completely autonomous. So it's doing all the processing and sensing on board. We actually speed it up because it turns out that if you do obstacle avoidance and the drone doesn't crash, it's actually pretty boring to watch. So we see it keeps turning. And I have to say, this is not an easy space because there's actually not a lot of texture. So we actually made a new stereo algorithm that was fast enough for this onboard processor, but we actually also complemented it with texture measurements. And if there was really too little texture, then we would also commence a turning maneuver. And here we see the onboard images plus the depth map on the right. Now, at the start of the presentation, I told you I was going to talk about swarms. And if we have single drones that can avoid obstacles, and then of course, the next step is to have multiple of them. And in the end, we want to, explore a whole building, for example, with these tiny drones. Now, I'm going to show you a picture, but I feel a little bit guilty because this is a picture of the opening of the Olympic Winter Games in South Korea. But just a few days ago, I saw a beautiful picture actually of the Day of the Dead in Mexico. There was also a beautiful drone show. And yeah, so you could say like these swarms of drones for shows, it's already here. But I think most of you will know that in these shows, the drones follow a predetermined GPS trajectory. And that means that if one of the drones, for example, has a wrong estimate, it may start bumping into the other ones. And then this can give, of course, huge problems. And so these drones are not aware of each other. And actually, the first problem that we tackled in Delft, starting in roughly 2014, was we started to look at how can our tiny drone know where other tiny drones are. Now, there was preliminary work that was based on infrared, because when they had ground robots, then infrared helped very well to localize other robots. But the problem with drones is that the other drones can be all around you. If you then take an infrared solution, then you need many infrared sensors, which becomes bulky and power hungry. The next idea may be to use vision. And obviously, nature uses it a lot. So, for example, birds, they use vision, obviously, to see each other. But the problem that we had was that on these tiny drones, we have cameras with a very limited field of view, so we cannot look all around us. These cameras are pretty low resolution. That means that it's very hard to detect other tiny drones because they only occupy a few pixels or even less. And even if we had high resolution omnidirectional vision, then vision processing would be computationally quite heavy, which was too much for us at the time. We also looked at audio, which is something that, for example, also the Lab of Intelligent Systems at the EPFL in Switzerland looked at. And I think also birds, they use audio, I guess, to hear each other or even warn each other. The only thing is that if you have tiny drones, they make a lot of noise themselves. That makes it very hard to hear other drones. And this problem is aggravated by the fact that other drones make noise basically in the same frequency. So it's really hard to do this. Now, then the most common solution, although there are not many works on swarming, most of them then use a scheme in which drones communicate coordinates to each other. And on the one hand, this can be GPS, GPS location, but this is not always available. And especially in our case, we wanted to do swarming indoors, so then GPS is not an option. Now, another option is that these drones map out the environment and share a common map, and then basically share their coordinates in that map. But this requires this kind of mapping that I, at the start of the talk, already said, we cannot do it on these tiny drones. So what did we do? We looked at signal strength. Now, this is a very easy concept. If you have a Wi-Fi router at home and you take your mobile phone, then you see these stripes of your Wi-Fi. And if you walk closer to the Wi-Fi router, you see more stripes, so a higher signal strength. So the signal strength is a measure of distance, and this can be easily used because we typically already have communication chips on the drones. It's low power, omnidirectional, and it's computationally very cheap. I have to say, we've built on this method. We can scale it to a certain number of drones, but in a communication-based detection, you will always have problems with interference and scalability. And another thing I want to add before we go on is that towards the future, I think vision and audio are most promising because they offer better scalability. But these challenges I just mentioned are still there today. Now, what did we do? In 2016, we came up with a scheme in which we're using Bluetooth, that's why this symbol, and this signal strength. But if you have signal strength, then you only know the distance to the other drone. It can then be on a sphere around you, and here in 2D, of course, on a circle around you. So how are you going to find out where exactly this other drone is? Well, you can do that by having them not only communicate to get the signal strength, but also communicating some state information. And what do they communicate? They communicate their body velocity. In this first study, we also communicated the robot's heading, like north or east. As to where were they heading? And you can imagine how this helps you solve the problem of finding out where the other one is. Because if you're hovering and the other drone is traveling forward, and it's saying, I'm traveling west, and you see it's getting closer, and then obviously it's to your east. And filtering over time with a common filter gives a solution. Now, we saw actually today a presentation about it by Shushuai, PhD student in the MAV-lab. But this is a very early experiment with Bluetooth, where we have 3 AR drones that fly in a restricted space. Without the avoidance, they would hit each other within 15 seconds, but they could now fly for minutes without touching. And here we showed that even with tiny pocket drones, you can do this with this Bluetooth method. Here they were constrained to fly in a 2x2 area, and also here they could avoid each other. Now, we subsequently expanded this. We're using ultra-wideband now as others because it's much more precise. So if you ever do this at home, use ultra-wideband. But I just wanted to show this early work and the kind of solution that we're using to make drones aware of each other. Now, if we then want this swarm to go into a building and explore it, we also need navigation. And that's a huge elephant in the room because, you know, SLAM is a well-known solution. I already told you that, yeah, we cannot run that on our limited platforms. But what do we do then, right? And there's basically no super cheap alternative yet. And that's one of the problems that we tackled next. Now, what we started to look at was bug algorithms. And bug algorithms are very interesting. And so a bug algorithm is actually a maze-solving algorithm. And so it suggests a bit that it's insect-inspired, but it comes more from a mathematical society, let's say, originally, for maze solving. We have an agent. It has a start location and a target location. And at every point where it is, it will know the vector towards the target. And this agent is not going to map out the environment, but instead it's just going to move towards the target. And if it encounters an object, it will just fly around it. And in bug algorithms, they call this wall following because they often use the walls as obstacles. And so here it tries to go there, sees the obstacle, it starts following to the left. Here it sees, hey, the path is free again, so it goes to the top left. It sees an obstacle, and it then, you know, does this wall following to the left again. You can notice already here that perhaps it would have been better to go to the right, but yeah, I mean, it's a really pretty simple algorithm. And by just following these simple rules, it in the end gets to the target. Now, this is, of course, super promising because these bug algorithms, they require no map and typically no memory or very limited memory. And so this is awesome. And the only problem we saw is that, the agent typically knows its location. So it knows where it is, it knows where the target is in like a world frame, and then knows where it should go to in the body relative frame. And why is that a problem? Yeah, it's through a back door, you introduce maps again, you know, we don't want these maps. And we had a look at the literature, and we looked at existing bug algorithms like COM1, Bug2, ELK1, ELK2, beautiful names. And we said, okay, what happens if we don't have a known location anymore? So how did we do this? We put the target, for example, here, the start here, and we have known coordinates. The only thing is that when it starts traveling from 0, 0, we now use odometry to give an idea to the agent where it is. Now, if this odometry is perfect, and that's this sigma 0 here, the light blue, then we get a pretty high success rates. And so 95% for ELK2. And so that's very good. But that's with perfect odometry, which basically corresponds to you knowing your position perfectly. But if we use odometry for our position and we let the noise take on realistic values, then this performance drops enormously. And so it drops from 95 to 30%. And so we need to invent something new here. And what we came up with was a new algorithm called, oh, okay, so there's actually another me going to talk. I don't know if you hear that, but okay, let's let him talk.
No, we cannot hear it, Guido.
Ah, you cannot hear it. Great.
No.
Okay. Then let me then replay this and I'll talk. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have the drones in a swarm spread out into different directions. And when they notice that their battery is half empty, then they will try to travel back to the starting point. And the starting point, what we will do is we will put one beacon there and the drones will fly and try to find out in which direction the signal strength is going to be higher. And so they're going to travel up gradient to the beacon. And that looks like this. So all these drones have a different desired direction. notice that their battery is almost half empty, and then start traveling back to this beacon here. And I think one of the things to see here is that, yeah, this helps them go back to the ground station, but they don't follow optimal paths. So you see here this purple one. Yeah, it thought, oh, great, go to the beacon, but then, yeah, it's not an optimal path. Yeah, it didn't make a map. But yeah, this suboptimality does allow us to run it on tiny drones. Now, you may say, okay, it's a little bit of cheating because we put this beacon at the ground station. I agree. I would like to see that differently in the future. But to be honest, from an application perspective, this is actually not so strange. If you're a search and rescue worker, like a policeman or whatever, and you send out your drones, yeah, then it would be very nice if the drones come back to you. And so if you have the antenna with you and you walk 10 meters further or to another location, it's very nice that they actually come back to you and perhaps not to the exact location where they started. And so I think this is a very doable assumption on a practical system. And so it utilizes a swarm and it uses this gradient to go back to a home beacon. And this allowed us to, for the first time, explore a pretty big real-world environment with tiny drones. And the tiny drone that we used will be well known, I think, in this group is the Crazyfly, made by Bitcraze. And in our case, it was weighing 33 grams. And so we even just used all the standard decks, so we didn't change anything. And so we also used the Crazyfly radio for having drones avoid each other. And that's almost as noisy as the Bluetooth. So that's also another thing that you may want to avoid if you want to make a serious system. But what I'm going to show you now is real world experiment. So Kimberly Maguire, the PhD student at the time, basically spent a month doing these experiments in an empty floor of our building. You see these circles that we draw around the drones. It's just because, yeah, they're so small, else you don't see them. And you also see a top view of the environment. This is not a map they're making, this is just us afterwards indicating where the drones are. And so we have this orange one here. You also see it here. It's now out of the view, but it will come back and then go into this room here. And so you see that it finds the room, goes in, explores this. And you see that within a few minutes, they're exploring this floor. You see that this green one is coming back to the home station here and is going to land in a second. It's also interesting. The blue one senses the orange one and avoids, and then senses it again and avoids it again. And we see that the orange one now lands, the blue one goes back. And together they visited almost all of the rooms in this floor as a swarm. I think this is also interesting. So we have the purple one here. Yeah, I would have liked it to go out of the room after one circle, but something happened. Didn't find the door or anything. And now the second time around, it actually goes out of the door. And this is, I think, typical also of natural swarms. There's some randomness, there's some redundance. And we actually did also experiments with cameras on board where they find dummies, basically, for a search and rescue scenario. And one of the cameras basically stopped working. But then there was another drone that found the dummy. This is what it looks like. And again, within a few minutes, they explored this whole floor. We did tests with multiple numbers of robots, and you obviously see that if you have more drones, you get more coverage in the same time. There's also a law of diminishing returns. So of course, between 2 and 4 drones, it's a bigger step than between 4 and 6. And at some point, of course, the drones will start getting into each other's way too much. And so this is something to be expected. I would like to show you the behavior. So again, we have a finite state machine that implements this bug algorithm. It's quite simple. Move forward, follow wall. This in itself is another finite state machine, by the way. So this is a slightly simplified view, but it may be clear that also here we implemented linking of simple behaviors to tackle with the exact same processor, by the way, the STM again, this very complex problem. Now, we even tackled a more complex problem recently, and we published this at last IROS. And we said, okay, let's have these drones not only fly into this unknown area and avoid obstacles, but let's also have them localize a gas source. And as I said in the beginning, when I was talking about the fruit fly, it's actually a very complex problem. And in robotics, you will often see experiments with an empty room and a single robot, and the room typically quite small. Now, there's multiple reasons for that. Yeah, it's a very hard task. Obstacles make it more difficult, not only because you have to avoid them, but also because if you have lots of obstacles in a complex environment, then the gas will not be diffusing in this area, but it will be spreading in a complex way in this complex environment. And we wanted to tackle actually this complex problem. Now, why would you want to find gas sources? If there's gas leaks in residential buildings, it's obviously very dangerous, or even industrial plants. And then now firemen have to go in, and it's very dangerous for them. They're pretty slow. And in industrial plants, you know, you may have a 3D problem, like there's a tube high up that is leaking, and we think that drones can be much quicker. But we also think they can help in greenhouses to for the early detection of pests or diseases, because you can actually smell this, or even find drugs, not for personal use, of course, but perhaps for policing purposes. Now, what is our approach? Our approach is very similar to what we just saw for the exploration. We have multiple drones, and well, they repulse each other, so they don't want to hit each other. They use their lasers to detect obstacles and be repulsed from obstacles. And in the same time, they try to go towards waypoints. In the beginning, these waypoints go into random directions, like we did before, in order to spread out over the environment. But as soon as one of the drones smells gas, then we actually start to try and find the gas source. And we do that with the help of particle swarm optimization. And this algorithm, and we have the different agents, it's these circles, and they're moving into different directions, it's the arrows. And if we look at this individual here, it will determine its new direction, so its new waypoint, by looking at what it smells now. Now this one is gray, it means that it doesn't smell anything. It also looks at its own previous best location, which was slightly red, so it smelled something. It's also going to look at the swarm's best location, which is quite dark red here. And then it's going to determine which way to move. And this particle swarm optimization is a population-based optimization method that if you give it a slightly larger population, it can avoid local minima, for example, which is necessary in complex environments. The other cool thing, by the way, is that this particle swarm optimization only requires you to measure the gas at your current location. So you don't have to determine gradients. You don't have to determine where the wind is coming from. And so in a sense, it's also very different than the fruit fly algorithm I explained before, because that would have had to sense the wind, which is very hard if there's only very small drafts. And so it uses very rudimentary information, but it uses the swarm to solve this complex problem. Now, another thing we did here is that we basically made this bug algorithm with particle swarm optimization in it. But yeah, you can hand tune the parameters. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to learn these parameters. And we did that with an evolutionary algorithm. And in order to do this, we needed to, of course, simulate many agents in simulation. And then we made something that was not existing in the area yet. We made a pipeline using all kinds of tools that did exist, at least partially, in which we generate an environment, in which we make a kind of three-dimensional map. And then we use open foam for computational fluid dynamics, creating like an inlet and an outlet. So we create a kind of airflow field. And this airflow field is then used together with a filament simulator that then spreads the gas through this environment over time. And this gives us a 3D concentration field over time. In this study, we were mostly focusing on 2D components because they were flying on one height. But you can do this also in 3D. And then we evolved the simulation. And what you see here is the result of evolution. As you see, agents are these circles, they have these lasers, and they avoid obstacles, they start to do particle swarm optimization. You see that in most environments, they zoom in quite well, they home in quite well on the source. There's a very difficult environment here where they actually find a local maximum. And this can be remedied by sending in more drones. because those would avoid these drones and then end up probably here at a higher location. Now, we then wanted to test this also in the real world. We used crazy flies again, but now we had a custom design made by Shushui, and also with the help of, oh, I almost forgot to mention this, very, very sorry. It's a collaboration with Barcelona University and Harvard University. So the hardware was also made together with Barcelona, and the algorithms were also developed together with Harvard University. But here we have the gas sensor. We have an ultra-wideband module that allows to localize these other drones. And this was also vital to make particle swarm optimization work. What I'm going to show you now, oh, I'm going to run this again, is a very highly sped up version of the experiments. What did we do? We had our cyber zoo. We placed obstacles, screens, and poles. We also placed an alcohol beaker with a little propeller so that it would spread the gas in the environment. And then what you should definitely look at are the small blue dots. So I hope it's kind of visible here. Then we have the beaker here. We have one drone here and now all of them. The beaker is here. The drones are going crazy here. Yeah, this is very sped up, like 20 times. You see that they home in on the beaker there. And then we have another environment. The beaker is here. The drones are going all around here. And they end up there. And we also tried out an empty environment, and all the drones end up here. I must say, I'm wondering if this is actually something you can see over the internet like this, with perhaps a poor connection. But anyway, what you should perhaps do is have a look at also the article and the YouTube video that we made with a bit more slower footage. So, but anyway, they succeed in finding the gas source in these complex environments. And interestingly, the evolved parameters also in the real world work better than the manual parameters that we set ourselves. And so this whole pipeline was working very well. Now, you may be wondering, and I hope I'm still well within time. Yes, okay, still have like 8 minutes. You may be wondering, okay, Guido, this STM microcontroller, is it magic? Can it do everything? Can we do everything that a fruit fly does or a honeybee with a STM microcontroller? No, unfortunately not. So we've been exploiting this insect intelligence at a very abstract level. And this abstract level lends itself well to implementation on this microcontroller. But I think that there is a limit to that. And this limit will happen in perception, especially high dimensional perception. And then, odor, okay, olfaction, yes, but definitely also vision. In vision, we basically just may need deep neural network kind of things. I said at the start that these deep nets, that the hardware is still too heavy and too energy consuming, but there is hope on the horizon, and it comes from neuromorphic sensing and processing. And there's going to be another keynote speech by Nicolas Marchand, which will fit very nicely, I think, with this kind of sensing and processing as well. So I would definitely encourage everybody to watch that. Now, what is neuromorphic vision? Well, there we use event-based cameras. So these cameras are different from the normal cameras. On the left, we have a normal camera filming a propeller. You see that, it sends images, but these are very, very blurry if the propeller twists. But we see this propeller rotating on the right because an event-based camera only perceives changes in brightness. So it only sends information in pixels that become brighter or darker. Darker is shown with red pixels, brighter with green pixels. And that means that we send much less information. This information can be sent much quicker and per pixel. So you really can get events on the microsecond scale. And the fact that these events are sparse also means that you can get to very high energy efficiencies. And so you will be spending much less energy as well in these cameras. And in our lab, we've been trying to combine these event-based cameras with spiking neural networks. Now, spiking neural networks are the third generation neural network, and they have a temporal dynamics much more similar to real neurons. where they have, for example, a leakage in the voltage, and where they spike when they transmit information. So they actually send bits to each other. And this leads to sparse parallel processing, which is fast and energy efficient. But there's a challenge. They're much more challenging to design and train. Although I have to say that in the past few years, there's a huge community in AI that is focusing on this, and we're getting better and better results. Now, the goal in the MAV-lab is to build fully neuromorphic, vision-based autonomous flight. So we have, for example, event-based sensors here, like the event-based camera. We have a spiking neural network, and we hope to directly send them signals to actuators. Now let's look at the case study to see what we did in this area. Now, also here we draw inspiration from nature. We look at honeybees, and when they land vertically, they do this by keeping the optical flow divergence constant. This was found by biologists in a study from 2013, for example. And when we look at drones, it looks like this. So we have a drone, we have a camera, it looks down, and if it goes down, then we have an optical flow field that expands. And the expansion rate is related to the divergence, which, if you express it in physical quantities, is the vertical velocity divided by the height. You can imagine that if you keep this constant, like the honeybee, then if you go lower, then this becomes smaller, and also the velocity will become lower. So as you go lower, you go slower. And to illustrate this, if a drone is at 10 meters and it's going down with 2 meters per second, and at 5 meters, it's going 1 meter per second, and at 1 meter, it's going 20 centimeters per second. And you may wonder, okay, it's a nice, simple strategy again, Guido, indeed, but it's actually not so easy to implement. So the most naive approach, which was also followed at the start of this area, was to take your measured divergence and your desired divergence, and you take this error and you just multiply it with a proportional gain. And you set the thrust to this value. If you do that, then you get this behavior. And so here we will see such a landing. We have the drone here, it's going down. So far, so good. It's going lower, it's going slower. But what you will notice as it gets close to the surface, something very strange happens. And this drone starts to oscillate. Now, this is a whole story about why these oscillations occur. Actually, it can be understood quite easily if you look back at this slide here. Z becomes very small, so this divergence is going to take on huge values. And if you throw this into your control system, then you have a problem. And yeah, there's a whole analysis of this and how drones can use this actually to their benefit. But I'm not going to talk about that today. What I'm going to talk about is how we took this approach and how we try to make it neuromorphic. And so what you just saw was a normal camera with normal images. We detect corners, we track corners to the next image, we extract optical flow this way. Then we look at the optical flow field, we make a linear fit, and the slope of this fit gives us the divergence, and this goes into our controller. I put a red box around this because, yeah, this is a very traditional pipeline. And what I want to discuss with you in the remaining minutes, and I'm going to go a few minutes over the 45 minutes, but I hope that is fine, is that, yeah, red is traditional. And when we make it neuromorphic, some things we tried out are off board or not in the loop, and we make it orange. Some things are on board and in the loop, but on conventional hardware, and it's light green. And we did also things on board, in the loop, and on neuromorphic hardware. This is what we want. We want, of course, this whole pipeline to be dark green. Now, what we started with was taking the event-based camera and using it for optical flow divergence landing. So this camera was on board, and we had to make new algorithms, but yeah, I would say still traditional ones that extract optical flow from the events, make this fit again, and give it to the drone. We did that in this article, and it led to super fast landings. It was actually the first time that anybody used an event-based camera in the control loop of a free-flying drone. And we could do divergence landings of 1, which means that at 5 meters, you're going 5 meters per second, at 3 meters per second. So it's a pretty fast landing. Then we looked at the following step, which was we don't want this traditional pipeline anymore. We want actually a spiking neural network that takes event-based inputs and outputs things like divergence at the end. And yeah, we did that in 2018, was published in 2019. And I'm still pretty proud of this work with our group, because what we achieved was a spiking neural network that used unsupervised learning. And what we needed to do is just present event-based inputs to it, and it would learn by itself to extract features, to extract local flow in this layer here, and then to extract divergence and ventral flow in this final layer as a optic flow observables. And this worked, but it's orange. We only did this off board because it still requires quite some neurons. And we're currently working on trying to do such a thing on board. Now, finally, and that's what I will talk to you most about and show you, is we also wanted, of course, to do the control with spiking neural networks. First, we did that by having a spiking neural network simulated on a normal CPU. But you see this dark green box here. Actually, this year we presented at ICRA our work on the first time that a neuromorphic chip was used on board a free-flying drone to perform the control of this drone. And it was extracting optical flow here and divergence. Then the divergence was encoded into spikes and sent into a spiking neural network to control the motor. What did we use? We used Intel's Loihi neuromorphic chip. We have a Bebop drone here with paparazzi software on it. It extracts divergence, encodes it as spikes, goes into this chip, and then it sends spikes back. To the thrust. I think I made a mistake here. In this study, we actually use ROS. Okay. Now, how does the spiking neural network look like, and what did we do? So we have this spiking neural network. And what we did is we evolved the spiking neural network in simulation and then transferred the solution to reality. And we did what they call a zero-shot transfer. And so after evolution, we put it on board. And yeah, I hope I don't give too much away when I say that it just works. So what did we do to make this work? Well, one, we knew that we could get divergence with our vision process, and we encoded it. And we encoded it in a way that is similar to this spiking neural network that you saw, so that later we can plug in this network there. Then the second thing we did is the output of the network is a thrust set point, which actually gives an acceleration set point for the z-axis for the drone, which is then executed by a low-level controller. And this low-level controller basically covers the reality gap that you may have in specific properties of your motors, etc. And then what we did is, we implement this on the neuromorphic chip, which, for example, had the 8-bit weight representation. So we evolved immediately with properties that matched that of the Loihi chip. Now, these are all things you can do to reduce the reality gap, but there may still be some things that are unpredictable. And these unpredictable elements, like what initial height does the drone have, delay, jitter, we randomize them during evolution so that the solution would be robust to them. This is the setup, which I'm going to skip a bit in the interest of time. What I would like to say is that we have an upboard on board that is pretty big, and it's actually only used to, there is paparazzi on board, Guido. Anyway, so that was only used to communicate between the paparazzi software on the drone and the Capo Bay neuromorphic chip. And this is what it looks like. And this is what it looks like when flying. This is just hovering to show the drone. But here we have an optical flow landing, zero shot, sim to real transfer. And I must say, I myself was almost surprised by the smooth landings that this drone gives with this setup. So we're very happy. First time that the neuromorphic chip was used to control a drone in free flight. Now, to wrap up, what's next? We would like to get rid of this beacon I talked about, so we want to also investigate insect-inspired, vision-based navigation. We have all the elements for the fully neuromorphic autopilot, but we still need to put it together. And that's still a sizable challenge. We also want, of course, to tackle more complex tasks, environments, and we would like to achieve even faster autonomous flight. We're still working on drone racing and tasks like that. The research team is huge because, yeah, I talked about many projects. Yeah, some of the names are here. There may still be others that I forgot, but yeah, just to say it was a huge, huge team effort. For the swarm exploration, we work together with Carl Tiles, who is now at DeepMind, and Bert Stappe, who is at Radboud University Nijmegen. For spiking, optical flow landing, we work with Sander Poté, expert in spiking nets at the CWI and the University of Amsterdam. And for the DelFly Nimbrel, we work together with Florian Meires of Wageningen University. And yeah, that's the end of my talk, and I will gladly take questions.
Thank you very much, Guido. Quite impressive, I must say. I really enjoyed the landing, well, the last part is quite impressive. I remember we watched, well, we didn't watch. We saw your keynote presentation in China when you gave the keynote for the IMAV in 2016. And 5 years later, now in this virtual conference, it's amazing to see what you are achieving with this type of technology with the same problem, right?
Exactly.
Because that has to tell you how difficult the problem is. I mean, we can buy a drone now, and it may have an automatic landing option, but really what it is behind it is quite complex and difficult. So very, very nice. Please, to the public, if you want to submit a question in the chat, please do it, send it to me. At the moment, we don't have questions, but I wanted to ask you your opinion on this type of neuromorphic processing for really agile flight. What do you think is going to be the window time for us to see a very agile drone using neuromorphic processing?
Yeah, I hope within 5 years, actually. Yeah, so that sounds perhaps optimistic, but I think it's actually quite doable. Yeah, so we already see very impressive work by other groups. For example, yeah, the group by Davide Scaramuzza in Switzerland. They've shown quite agile flight in forests, where a large part of the solution is a neural network. Now, I must say it's not completely a neural network yet. So we're also working on that to actually replace even larger parts of that pipeline by a neural network. In the end, yeah, if you want to do it fully in a neuromorphic autopilot, it has to be fully neural. Yeah, so perhaps I'm still slightly underestimating the problem there, but I think we will see that yeah, within 5 years. And then there's the gap still between artificial neural networks, the normal ones, and the spiking ones. But we're closing this gap, yeah, relatively quickly, I would say, because yeah, if you follow the AI community, there's now methods for backpropagation that use surrogate gradients that actually start working quite nicely. And so we've also been applying it to quite complex problems already. So yeah, I expect that within 5 years, you can do most things that you can do with a normal traditional neural network. You can do it also with a spiking net. And then there is the hardware. And the hardware currently is, I mean, it's great that they have it. They're opening it up to research groups, but yeah, it still has, let's say, small problems. And these problems we need to solve. Like, for example, yeah, being able to easily interface it with yeah, sensors without needing an upboard, for example. So, but I think, yeah, these things are solvable. And so, yeah, I kind of hope, you know, within 5 years that we actually see very agile flight. And my personal dream is, of course, that we can do this not only on then, yeah, the bigger drones, but really on like DelFly sized vehicles.
Thank you, Guido. We still don't have questions on the chat, so please don't be shy. Ask your questions. Yeah, we don't have them on the social networks either. So I will take the opportunity to ask you. Because you mentioned that you are using these event cameras, and when we saw them several years ago, maybe 10 years ago, personally, I thought the type of data that these cameras deliver is too complicated, because even though it is very simple, because they give you just where the pixels change in intensity, you have to process them, right? Because then you get millions of data, and somehow you have to process them. And at the outset of this technology, people just try to map it into something conventional, like to reconstruct the image and then apply conventional computer vision algorithms. And in your presentation, you mentioned that now you can use convolutional neural networks or these spike networks to process that data. And the question is, that might work, might be very nice, because then the neural networks take care of interpreting the data. But then what about explainability? You know, like in this, in artificial intelligence, people are worrying about how the neural networks take decisions. And especially if you're going to put these things on board drones, like let's imagine that you have a drone, taxi drone, right? Like it takes people from one place to another. And you might use event cameras and neural processing. So do you think the industry will be ready for that, or the governments or regulations? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, a super interesting question, Jose. So let's say, okay, the explainability first. So yeah, explainability is a general problem, let's say, with deep neural networks. But personally, I think people don't analyze their networks enough. So no offense to all the people out there, but I think, you know, when you look at biologists, they have a much bigger challenge, because they need to measure these neurons, and they actually sometimes succeed in doing that even during operation, but then yeah, they cannot measure a lot, right? So if you take a fruit fly, it's super hard. But we, yeah, I mean, it's artificial intelligence, right? So we can track all the neurons. We actually know exactly what's happening. And the only problem is we created a complex system in the true sense of the word, because these neurons are simple elements that together give rise to these complex capabilities. And we basically don't understand how it works. But yeah, I must say, in our group, we have been investigating how deep neural networks perform tasks like, for example, depth estimation. Because nowadays you can also give a normal image and a deep net, and it gives you a depth. And we humans also do this. If you close an eye and you don't move, you still see depth. But it's not very amenable to mathematical analysis. So a learning method is the best, and these methods are getting really good. But our question was, how does it work? And what we did is we looked actually at methodologies in psychology. And the advantage we have is we can also still influence this network. But for this first study, we regarded it as a black box. And we took Kitty, the Kitty data set with self-driving cars, and we manipulated the cars. And we found out that these depth networks are actually doing something very simple. If you look in front of you and you see the floor with objects, then things that are closer will touch the floor lower in your image than things that are further away. And these networks turned out to do this. By manipulating the input data and things like that, we were able to find out this is the main cue that they exploit. And I think that this kind of analysis, you can take it even further, because yeah, we looked also at optical flow neural networks, and then we really looked at what happened to the neurons and activations of neurons. You can basically piece apart after the fact, after learning, and what are the main principles that it's using. And when you know these principles, then you can much better predict how well they will generalize and what the problems will be of these networks. And I think if we do this and we combine that with statistical evidence that it just works very well, then we're much closer to getting these networks accepted than when you just look at the statistics and you don't analyze these solutions in depth.
Thank you, Guido. Yeah, it's a very good answer.
Thank you.
It gives hope for this type of developments. And a final question, because at the beginning of your presentation, you talk about the Alpha Pilot, the competition that you won. And recently, as you said, David's group from the University of Zurich, he showed this very nice work where he finally beated up a pilot, a human pilot, but he was using a motion capture system for localization. And I'm bringing this up because you were talking about your localization system for the tiny drones. So they might not be entirely related, or perhaps might not be used in a straightforward way to the autonomous drone racing problem. But from your perspective and your own experience, is the motion capture system or the localization the most important thing for the autonomous drone racing?
Yeah, so very good question. So yeah, to first say, I think they're doing super impressive things. I mean, they really beat human pilots on their track. I'm also very sure that they're working on the perception part. So there's no telling when they will be finished with that. On our side, if I look at the air race, we recently published actually our article, first on the archive. One of the differences between our team and the other teams is that we were the only one, or I think almost the only one, not using visual odometry. And the team, the solution that, for example, UZH used for air, used odometry algorithms, and those were the limiting factor for them at that time. And so they basically limited speed to 8 meters per second. In our approach, we basically wanted it to work also at faster speeds. And so we only looked at the gates, and we trained our deep neural network for gate detection also at very high motion blur. And what we're working now in our group as well, somebody's unmuted, I think, making some noise, but one of the things that we're working in our lab right now is to do odometry with deep neural networks, also dealing with high amounts of blur. Yingfu Xu is one of our PhD students. He's working on that. And yeah, I think it's definitely going to be one of the challenges, how to estimate your motion, but also your location in the circuit while doing these amazing maneuvers that we already see from the group in Switzerland, like they do flips and whatever. And I'm sure that drones can do it better than humans because the processing happens on board compared to the human pilots. But I do think that's still a sizable challenge. We're contributing, we hope to contribute to this challenge to also solve the perception side of this autonomous drone race.
Yes, Guido, thank you. Exactly, because humans, the way they do it now is that somehow they memorize the track, the race track. I am not a pilot myself, but I find it quite difficult to think that a human really memorizes position, global position within the racetrack.
Yeah, they definitely don't, I think.
They just react. They react and they have some memory of the room, right?
Yeah, it's the same with like, when is this drone racing solved, right? When do you really beat the human? And so on the track in Texas, we actually, we were still quite far away in a sense, but not that far away. But it was a very limiting track. It was 2D basically, and no flips or whatever necessary. But if you look at human drone races, you can actually sit together. And then one says, okay, I'm going to fly around and you watch my video stream. And then you do the same round. And as humans, if you have some gates, they may even have different shapes or whatever. One round is enough to know which track you need to follow, right? So, and I do think that we really use visual landmarks basically to remember this track. And that's yet another step, I think. So indeed, I think it's a bit like a gradation, like how to solve this drone racing. But it's one of the challenges. So I completely agree with you. It's something that we will not do. What we will not do is use odometry to follow a global coordinate. We'll use cues in the environment, and this can be known gates or into the future perhaps gates that are only known, some moments before the competition. Of course, you do need to know what way to go, else you can never go fast.
Yes, exactly. And especially to predict what is coming next, because you may react to what you are seeing at the moment, but humans have the capability to project forward and to know that some gates are coming. So at some point, they are stopping planning how to cross the current gate because they know they will do it, and they begin to plan on what is coming next. And that, I think, is quite amazing, and it would be very nice to study, to get a deeper study on that. But anyway, Guido, it has been a pleasure, a very, very nice talk. And to the public, I would like just to say that Guido is full professor in bio-inspired micro-air vehicles from the Department of Aerospace Engineering from Delft University of Technology. And once more, it has been an honor, a very nice talk, very nice ideas. So thank you, Guido. We will send you a diploma of your participation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks to the public for being there. And,